We tend to assume that having children back in the deep past was the one thing nobody controlled. The free-for-all, the part of life that was pure instinct. You wanted a child. You had a child, no rules, no permission, no paperwork. The end. It is the most natural thing in the world, right? Surely this, of all things, was simple, wrong. It turns out that the question of who got to have children and with whom may have been one of the most heavily regulated, rule-bound, quietly policed aspects of ancient human life. Not by governments, there were none. Not by written laws, there was no writing, but by something far older and far harder to escape. The invisible web of taboos, kinship rules, alliances, and survival pressures that every human group on Earth seems to have built around reproduction. Your ancestors did not just pair up and have babies. They moved through a hidden system that decided who was even eligible, a system nobody wrote down, that everyone obeyed, and that almost no one questioned. Because to them, it wasn't a rule at all. It was just the way the world worked. And here is the part that should get your attention. That system is still shaping your life today, right now in ways you have never noticed. The instinct you'll feel later in this video, the gut-level sense of what is right and what is forbidden, is a fossil, a leftover, a rule your ancestors made tens of thousands of years ago, still running quietly inside you. So let's pull back the curtain on it. Let's find out how ancient humans actually decided who was allowed to have children. So stick with me. Let's start with the single strangest fact in this whole story. When anthropologists went out and surveyed human societies across the entire planet, hundreds of them on every continent, from dense farming civilizations to small mobile bands of hunter-gatherers, they were looking for things that were truly universal, things that every human culture does, no matter how isolated, no matter how different. And those universals are surprisingly rare. Not every culture has the wheel. Not every culture has writing or money or agriculture. But here is something nearly every human society that has ever been studied does have: rules about who you can reproduce with. Every one of them independently cultures separated by oceans, by tens of thousands of years, by languages that share no common root whatsoever. All of them, on their own, arrived at the same basic idea. That you cannot simply have children with anyone you like, that some pairings are forbidden, some are encouraged, and the difference between them matters enormously. This is one of the closest things we have to a true human universal, more universal than the wheel, older, almost certainly, than farming, than cities, than written language, which raises a genuinely enormous question. Why did every human group that ever existed, without comparing notes, independently decide that reproduction needed rules? To answer that, we have to start with the oldest rule of all, the one that shows up absolutely everywhere: the incest taboo. Now, this is the part where people assume the answer is obvious. We avoid having children with close relatives because it is genetically dangerous, right? And that is true. But hold on, because the real story is much stranger and much more interesting than a simple biology lesson. Yes, reproducing with very close relatives increases the risk that harmful recessive traits will surface in children. Small, isolated populations that became too inbred have suffered real consequences for it throughout history. The biology is real. But here is the problem with assuming that is the whole answer. Ancient humans had no concept of genetics. None. They didn't know what a gene was. They couldn't have reasoned their way to "we should avoid this to protect the recessive allele frequency of our offspring." So how did a rule that lines up so neatly with genetics appear in cultures that knew nothing about genetics at all? The answer seems to be that evolution built the rule directly into our feelings and let the feelings do the work. There is a phenomenon that researchers call the Westermarck effect, named after the anthropologist who first described it. The basic finding is this: human beings who grow up together in early childhood, in close daily domestic proximity, during the first years of life, tend to develop a powerful automatic sexual aversion to each other later on. It doesn't matter much whether they're actually related by blood. What matters is that intense early closeness, children raised together simply don't, as a rule, develop desire for one another as adults. In fact, they often feel a strong revulsion at the very idea, and there is a striking piece of evidence for this. In certain communal child-rearing arrangements where large groups of unrelated children were raised together almost like siblings from infancy, researchers found that those children, grown up, almost never married each other, despite no rule forbidding it, despite their families sometimes hoping they would. The early closeness had quietly switched off the attraction. Evolution had installed an invisible fence. There is a second, older case that points the same way. drawn from historical marriage customs in parts of East Asia. In some communities, families would adopt a young girl and raise her from early childhood alongside the son she was eventually expected to marry, the two growing up together almost as siblings before becoming husband and wife. On paper, it was efficient. In practice, these marriages were notably troubled. They produced fewer children, and the partners were more likely to be unhappy or to stray compared to marriages between people who met later in life. The very intimacy of growing up side by side seemed to dampen the desire that was supposed to bloom. Once again, the early closeness had thrown the switch. The aversion didn't care what the families wanted. It simply fired. So the incest taboo isn't really a law that ancient humans had to consciously enforce most of the time. It is a feeling, a deep built-in aversion that made the dangerous pairing feel wrong before anyone had to explain why. And then on top of that biological foundation, cultures layered explicit rules, stories, and taboos that named the forbidden categories out loud and extended them far beyond the household to cousins, to clans, to entire categories of people you might never even have met. That gut feeling you have, the one that makes certain pairings feel instinctively wrong, is the Westermarck effect firing in your own brain, exactly as it fired in your ancestors. You are running the rule right now, and you never had to be taught it. But here is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because the incest taboo did something far bigger than just prevent inbreeding. It forced humans to do one of the most important things our species has ever done. It forced us to connect, think it through. If you are forbidden from pairing within your own close family group, then to have children at all, you must form a bond with someone from outside it. Another family, another band, another group of people who, without that rule, might have stayed total strangers or even rivals. The incest taboo didn't just keep families apart, it pushed them together. It wove separate groups into a single interconnected web. The anthropologist Levi-Strauss built much of his life's work around exactly this idea. He argued that the rules governing who marries whom are, at their core, a system of exchange and alliance. When two groups exchange partners, when a young person from one band joins another to start a family, those two groups are no longer strangers. They are now bound together. They share grandchildren. They have a reason to trade with each other, to help each other in hard times, to not make war on each other. The web of who can pair with whom is secretly the web that holds human society together. So who got to have children with whom was never just about the two people involved. It was about diplomacy. It was about survival. It was about turning a dangerous world full of strangers into a network of relatives. You can still see the machinery of this in how hunter-gatherer groups are structured. In most foraging societies that have been studied, when young people come of age, some of them leave the band they were born into and join another. A pattern anthropologists call exogamy, marrying out. It might be the women who move in one society, the men in another, but the principle is the same everywhere. You do not keep all your children at home and pair them with each other. You send some of them out, and you receive others in over generations. This constant gentle outflow and inflow stitches neighboring bands together into a much larger community of people who all know they are related somehow, even if they rarely meet. A band that tried to keep entirely to itself, pairing only within its own ranks, will not just risk the dangers of inbreeding. It would cut itself off from the very alliances that let people survive a crisis. It would be, in the truest sense, alone, and alone in the deep past was how groups died. This also helps explain something dark that haunts the edges of human prehistory. Groups that were bound together by marriage and shared children were far less likely to destroy each other. The bonds created by who pairs with whom were, quite literally, peace treaties written in flesh and blood. To raid the band your daughter married into is to raid your own grandchildren. The exchange of partners between groups was one of the oldest tools humans had for keeping the peace, and when those bonds broke down or never formed, the door to violence between strangers swung open, deciding who could have children with whom wasn't a soft romantic matter. It was, at times, the difference between alliance and war. And that is where the second great force comes in. Because once pairings became alliances, they became far too important to leave purely up to young people and their feelings. In many ancient and traditional societies, the decision of who would pair with whom was, to varying degrees, made by the wider group, by elders, by families, by the web of kinship obligations that everyone was born into. A young person didn't simply choose. They were guided, encouraged, sometimes promised to a particular partner years in advance, sometimes steered firmly away from the person they actually wanted. Because the stakes weren't just personal happiness. The stakes were the alliances between families, the sharing of scarce resources, and the survival of the whole group. This is why, across so many cultures, you find elaborate kinship systems, so intricate that anthropologists need diagrams to map them. Systems that sort everyone in the group into categories: who is a potential partner, who is forbidden, who is the ideal match, who is off limits. In some societies, particular cousins were considered the perfect match precisely because such pairings reinforced existing alliances in a stable, predictable way. These weren't random customs. They were social machines, refined over countless generations, for managing the single most consequential decision a small group could make. And there was another force quietly shaping all of this, one we have to talk about. Honestly, status. Power, because the rules about who could pair with whom were never applied perfectly evenly. In many human groups, individuals with higher standing, the best hunters, the most respected, the families with the most allies and the most influence, had an easier time securing desirable partners, and sometimes more than one. The genetic record actually bears the fingerprints of this. When researchers read the DNA of living humans, they find signs that across much of our history, a relatively small number of high-status men fathered a disproportionate share of children, while many others fathered none at all. Status didn't just bring respect, it bent the curve of who got to reproduce. For ordinary people, this meant the question of having children was tangled up with the whole social order, with reputation, with skill, with which family you belonged to, with how much you had to offer. A young person who was seen as a good provider, generous, capable, well-connected, was eligible in a way that someone on the margins of the group might not be. It was rarely as blunt as a formal verdict. It was subtler than that, and in a way more total, the entire web of the group's regard quietly sorted who was a desirable match and who was overlooked. Being allowed to have children, in practice, often meant being valued by the people around you. The community's judgment was the gatekeeper, and it was always watching. Now, I want to be honest with you about the harder edges of this, because the deep past was not gentle, and I don't want to pretend it was. In a world of real scarcity, where a single bad season could starve a group, where every child required years of intensive care and an enormous investment of food and energy, the question of reproduction carried a weight we can barely imagine today. A group could only support so many young children at once. Bringing a new life into the world was not just a joy, it was a profound demand on everyone. And so the timing of children, the spacing of them who could realistically raise one and when, these things were shaped, sometimes harshly, by the brutal arithmetic of survival. Hunter-gatherer groups often had children spaced years apart, far more widely than you might expect, partly because a mother carrying and nursing one child through a nomadic life simply could not manage two infants at once. Picture the practical reality in a group that moves with the seasons, following game and water. There are no strollers, no wagons. A small child who cannot keep up has to be carried, along with everything else the group owns. One child in arms is a heavy daily burden. Two would be nearly impossible. The constant movement, the long years of nursing, the demands of the body all work together to naturally space births, often to once every 3 or 4 years. Survival itself was, in a sense, one of the quiet rule makers, deciding not through law but through sheer hard necessity who could bring a new life into the group, and when the group could bear the cost. These are difficult realities, and it would be dishonest to dress them up. But I want to be careful here because it is easy to hear all of this and conclude that ancient life was cold or calculating or cruel about children. The evidence points overwhelmingly in the opposite direction, because here is the part nobody tells you. Here is what all of these rules were actually for. We hear rules about reproduction, and our modern minds immediately jump to control, to oppression. Is something being taken away? And yes, these systems could be restrictive, and they could fall hardest on the people with the least power. That is true and worth saying plainly, but step back and look at what the system as a whole was doing, and something remarkable comes into focus. Every one of these rules, the incest taboo, the kinship categories, the alliances, the careful management of who paired with whom, was, at its heart, a solution to the same problem. How does a small, fragile band of human beings survive in a hard world? And the answer humans found again and again was not alone. Never alone. You survive by being woven into others, by turning strangers into family, by building a web of obligation and care so dense that when your own group hit a crisis, a drought, a death, a failed hunt, there was another group out there, bound to you by children and marriage and shared blood, that would take you in. The rules about who could have children were the threads of that web. They were how humans built the largest, most cooperative, most interconnected societies of any animal on Earth, long before cities, long before writing, long before writing, long before any of it. Reproduction wasn't controlled to punish people. It was controlled because, in the deep past, who you bonded with determined who would survive the winter. The rules were, in the end, an act of collective care, a fragile species figuring out how to hold itself together. So now let's go back to that question we started with. How did ancient humans decide who was allowed to have children? The answer is that they decided it the way they decided almost everything that mattered together, through a vast, invisible, inherited system of feeling and custom and obligation that nobody designed and everybody lived inside. A built-in aversion that kept the family safe. A web of kinship that turned strangers into allies, a weight of survival that shaped the timing of every new life. And underneath all of it, a single deep logic: bind yourselves to each other or don't survive. And here is what gets me. You are still inside that system right now. That instinct that makes certain pairings feel wrong. That is the ancient fence still standing in your mind. The fact that your family has opinions about who you bring home, that is the kinship web, still pulling its threads. The complicated map of who you're related to, who is family and who isn't, the whole architecture of your family tree. Every bit of it is the descendant of rules our ancestors built around this exact question, tens of thousands of years ago, by firelight in a world we would barely recognize. We think of having children as the most personal, private, instinctive freedom there is, and in our time, thankfully, it has become far more of an individual choice than it ever was before. But for almost the entire human story, it was the opposite. It was the opposite. It was the most social, most consequential, most carefully woven decision a group could make. Not because love didn't matter. It did. It always did. But because love, in the deep past, was never just yours. It belonged to everyone whose survival depended on the web it would either strengthen or break. So here is my question for you, and I really do want to know, when you feel that pull, your family's opinions, your gut sense of who is right and who is forbidden, the quiet weight of what others expect, does it change anything to know that feeling is tens of thousands of years old? That it isn't really about you at all, but about a fragile species that learned long ago that the only way to survive was together. Let me know in the comments. I read them, and the answers people give to questions like this are always the most human part of all of it. Until then, take care of yourselves and of each other, and I'll see you soon.